Welcome everybody to another Platform Edition Tech Talk. Today we'll actually be getting into a number of exciting new security features with the release of Splunk 9.0, as well as some security disclosures and vulnerabilities that will be actually fixed and patched in the 9.0 release as well. As with most of our Tech Talks, there will be some forward-looking statements for things that are not yet released. While what we discuss during this Tech Talk does reflect our current expectations based on the information currently available to all the presenters today, any forward-looking statements are not guarantees of future performance, and some things are subject to change. Now, with that said, we are very glad that you're tuned into this Tech Talk, and we do hope it is worth your while. And just as a reminder, our Tech Talks are really intended to be focused, short webinars that are deep dives for most of our technical practitioners, so typically Splunk admins. We really do value you as our customers, and we want to make sure that your Splunk journey is as smooth as possible and that we equip you with the best practices and information that we can provide so that you can then leverage that in your daily administration and work on the Splunk and Splunk Cloud platforms. As I mentioned before, we're going to be covering a few things today. The first is our mission statement around security of the Splunk platform and our goals there. Then we'll cover off on security capabilities that we're launching in concert with the Splunk 9.0 release, some advisories that we're also releasing for the month of June. There's more to come on that, including details related to identifying and resolving the associated vulnerabilities. And lastly, some resources to help you through the upgrade process to Splunk 9. Splunk experts that can lend a hand during your upgrade and planning process, as well as the best practices associated with those security disclosures for the month of June and thereafter. Now, this Tech Talk would be far less interesting and probably far less valuable if I didn't have some very awesome and important colleagues joining me today. So you'll be hearing from obviously myself, Kyle Champlin. I'm a product manager here at Splunk, but also offering their expertise today as we walk through a number of deep dive topics are Farzad Salim, who's a senior principal product manager here at Splunk within our core security area of the product. With him is Nabil Samad, who is also a senior principal engineer within the same team. And lastly, and perhaps most infamously, Sanford is joining us from customer success. Sanford Owings has been with Splunk for quite a long time and has provided a lot of expertise to a lot of customers, both in his capacity in professional services many years ago and even today as a technical solutionist. So without further ado, we're going to get started. So thanks again for making the time today. And just as a reminder in general, that at Splunk we really do try to place customers and security at the forefront of everything that we do. We're obviously committed to helping customers identify and remediate security issues quickly. And in fact, we'll be talking about some resources at the tail end of this with just how to practically get some of these taken care of. We also provide advisories and patches for any vulnerability considered critical or high. And we'll actually be going into more depth on this, both in terms of the specific vulnerabilities disclosed for the month of June, but also for an ongoing basis and resources to help you stay on top of your security program. And also Splunk is hyper-vigilant and focused on both outstanding customer experiences, but also, and probably more importantly, outcomes. Fundamentally, we're here to make sure that you get the most value you can out of Splunk, and part of that also means ensuring that you run Splunk in as secure a fashion as possible. So the release of Splunk 9.0 is obviously very exciting for a number of reasons, and there are a bunch of capabilities that we're delivering, both in terms of our Splunk Cloud platform, of course, but also for enterprise, and that's across a number of pillars, whether it's new capabilities for edge data processing, federated search, or even things like extensible hooks for MLTK that are coming out with 9.0. The focus of the talk today really is around improving the security posture of the Splunk platform. That includes obviously both Splunk Cloud and Splunk Enterprise. And so we'll be taking you through a number of features and capabilities really focused on that, at least for today's Tech Talk. So when we talk about that pillar of improved security posture for the 9.0 release, it's important to call out that there are 65 fixes that we've actually delivered as part of the 9.0 release that are already in what we would call enforcement mode, or effectively default on. So those fixes really require no specific action other than the process of upgrading your Splunk environment to 9.0. However, we'll also be going into great depth on 8 particular security advisories we're releasing for the month of June. Those are actually in what we call warning mode. So while the underlying software fix is in place, we've put in a configuration flag or a feature flag that you need to manually opt into after the upgrade to 9.0 in order to fully take advantage of those improvements. The reason for doing this is mostly to ensure consistency and that we don't change any sort of product behaviors. It also allows you to make certain adjustments to your rollout schedule so that you're not having to worry too terribly much about anything other than just the upgrade itself. And perhaps maybe the most exciting of all of this are the 3 new security features that we're actually releasing with the 9.0 release as well. And with me to talk about those is Farzad. So over to you, Farzad.
Thank you, Kyle, for an excellent overview. As you mentioned, with Splunk 9.0, we will be releasing Splunk Assist, a brand new cloud-connected service for Splunk Enterprise. Splunk Assist relies on telemetry data that customers opt in to share with us. And when it's enabled, it evaluates the security-relevant deployment details and shares recommendations in a new monitoring console. Splunk admins then can review and take actions on these recommendations to improve the security posture of their deployments. In the following slides, I will provide more details about the scope and the coverage of Splunk Assist. But first, I have to make a legal disclaimer that Splunk Assist makes recommendations only and does not guarantee security by default. The security insights that Splunk Assist covers are divided into 3 core focus areas. First is Splunk Assist, which identifies TLS certificates that are used by Splunk nodes, such as forwarders, indexers, and search heads. For instance, as many of you may be aware, Splunk to Splunk, or S2S, protocol that governs the communication between forwarders and indexers heavily relies on TLS certificates. So Certificate Assist proactively identifies and highlights the certificates that are at the risk of expiry. From experience, certificate validity issues have been one of the primary pain points leading to the downtime and data loss for our customers that we are trying to reduce with the help of Certificate Assist. The second area is Config Assist, which evaluates Splunk's many configuration files, such as server.conf, authentication.conf, or rest.conf, and highlights the settings for which a secure alternative is available for a given deployment. And so today, the scope of Config Assist is not exhaustive, but it covers some of the most critical settings, including TLS, SAML, and REST endpoint. Finally, App Assist will scan and identify insecure apps and add-ons and proposes actions needed to improve their security posture. However, App Assist is not going to be shipped with Splunk 9.0 and is planned for future releases. I'm happy to share that Splunk 9.0 will also release native support for smart card authentication. This capability primarily targets our Splunk Enterprise federal customers who, for compliance reasons, must use Common Access Card or CAC cards, which is a form of a smart card, as the only method for authenticating their users into Splunk search heads. For a long time, these customers had to rely on third-party solutions by placing search heads behind proxies or firewalls to support this form of user auth. With Splunk 9.0, with minimal configuration setting, smart card authentication can be enabled on the product itself, and it will use authentication modules that are built into the product, shipped, and supported by Splunk. And finally, I would like to call out a new version of Upgrade Readiness app that we will be shipping with Splunk 9.0. In a nutshell, URA identifies the apps that may be affected by breaking change and recommends the steps that needs to be taken in order for a successful upgrade to take place. Many of you may have already used previous versions of URA in migrating, for instance, from Python 2 to Python 3. With Splunk 9.0, what is new is URA is going to be having additional rules to specifically help with identifying apps and add-ons, either being private or public, that may break due to the lack of TLS certificate validation. if this change was to be enforced. Note that with Splunk 9.0, and the changes are going in the potential breaking changes are going out in the warning mode, so there is no breakage there. And this essentially helps in helping administrators to get ready for volunteering enforcing those changes and upgrading their apps. In the following slides, Kyle will provide a detailed overview of the security advisory that's being released by Splunk 9.0 and going into the details of the fixes and the security fixes that will be released. Thank you. Off you, Kyle.
Thanks, Farzad, for that thorough and comprehensive review of the new security capabilities we're bringing out with Splunk 9.0. So let's get into the actual advisories and the associated recommended solutions. It's also important to take a minute and reiterate that there are a number of fixes that we released with Splunk 9.0 that actually require no action by the administrator to turn on to enforcement mode. Again, we've already turned these capabilities on for you by default. At a very high level, things like improved dashboard security and sanitizing input fields, as well as standard updates to third-party packages that we do regularly with new releases of Splunk, as well as increased control around capabilities that you can grant to roles within the Splunk platform. Lastly, there are some additional role-based filtering capabilities, but in general, there should not be any action after the upgrade required by admins to take advantage of these specific fixes. Now, with regards to the 8 advisories that we'll be releasing or announcing in June, and the subject of the remainder of this tech talk, we really have 4 major categories that you should be aware of. The first one, and probably the broadest one, is intra-Splunk TLS. We'll get into more detail about what TLS is if you're not familiar. There's also deployment server and universal forwarder advisories that are going out as well. There's Python or app layer TLS, as we refer to it. And lastly, some specific disclosures with regards to the search language, what we're referring to as the SPL category. With all of these, there's ample documentation to walk you through how to properly configure your Splunk environment to take advantage of these particular fixes. More importantly, though, we also go through what is shipping in what we call warning mode versus enforcement mode. What you'll see is that for the deployment server and universal forwarder category, there are 2 fixes and 2 disclosures that we're actually shipping in enforcement mode. You can read the documentation links to get more details about what that looks like for you. But the big change there is ultimately that when you upgrade to 9.0, the changes will be on by default for enforcement, and for anything marked as warning, you'll have to opt into those changes to make them in enforcement mode. And again, for the fixed versions, you can see that between Splunk Cloud Platform or SCP versus Splunk Enterprise, which versions are impacted and which versions are fixed. And before I hand it off to my colleagues for a deeper dive into each of the areas, it's really important to note that in general, we'll be issuing security advisories on a regular basis. So these 8 that we're talking about today are obviously focused for the 9.0 release, as well as for a specific set of versions for Splunk Cloud Platform. However, that's just for the month of June. Obviously, as we discover new vulnerabilities in our software or as they're disclosed to us by third parties, we believe it's incredibly important to continually have a program and process around delivering fixes to customers as well as notifying them about those fixes. So a major action item for you all who are attending this webinar is to subscribe to our product security page. We actually have an RSS feed you can subscribe to where you'll get regular updates anytime there are new disclosures issued, as well as just ways to interact with our security team, whether it's reporting a security vulnerability that you found or understanding what our security and data privacy rules are here at Splunk. There are a lot of resources at the product security portal, and I highly recommend you go check it out. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of each of the security disclosures and the ways to remediate them after upgrading to 9.0, we did want to take a moment to just discuss this term we'll be using a lot called Transport Layer Security, or TLS. You may be more familiar with its predecessor, SSL, but TLS is the protocol that Splunk uses to secure data in transit, both between Splunk nodes, so search head clusters, KV store, cluster manager, deployer, forwarders, etc., as well as between Splunk and any external services, so scripted inputs, modular inputs as well. And there are a few facets to TLS. It's actually a pretty complicated area of technology that not a lot of folks are familiar with. So what we're mostly going to be talking about are both certificate validation functions within Splunk, as well as hostname validation. Just so you know, there's a bunch of articles on Wikipedia, and you can Google TLS to get yourself more familiar with it. But effectively, it sort of services two capabilities. It's both to secure the actual communication, meaning encrypt it between one or two or more nodes. It's also used to authenticate things. So in the case of like the universal forwarder and indexers, it's used to authenticate both the indexer to the forwarder as well as the forwarder to the indexer when configured properly and appropriately. So with that now sort of teed up, I'm going to hand it off to Nabil, my colleague in engineering, to go into each of the disclosures one by one.
Thank you, Kyle, for giving an overview of TLS and some of its intricacies. Our first advisory concerns TLS communications between Splunk to Splunk nodes in Splunk Enterprise and the Splunk Cloud Platform. In short, by default, any communication between two Splunk nodes or the public internet did not validate TLS certificates for all node types. So, for example, if you had a searcher cluster or an indexer cluster out of the box, and if you did not configure TLS as recommended by our documentation, all communication between these nodes would not be secured by TLS. Now, on the other hand, if you did take corrective action in that you followed our TLS guide to generate properly signed and trusted certificates, then your Splunk deployment is not vulnerable. This change is being deployed in what we call warning mode, in that a log will be emitted on restart. Splunky restarts, warning users that TLS validation has been turned off. For remediation, please upgrade your deployment to Splunk Enterprise 9.0 and configure TLS per the documentation, relevant documentation. For Splunk Cloud, this should already be remediated by our operations team. Our second advisory concerns the lack of TLS hostname validation for Splunk to Splunk communication in both Splunk Enterprise and the Splunk Cloud Platform. To expand on that, TLS hostname validation is a critical component of the cert validation process that verifies the remote server's identity by checking if the hostname a client is connecting to matches any of the names present in the server's certificate's common name or subject ELP name fields. So for a client connecting to a server, in addition to validating if the server's certificate is valid, basically the expiry and the authenticity, we also validate that the host name the client is connecting to matches the host name embedded in the TLS certs, CN or SN or SAN field. For Enterprise, this basically means that if you had TLS configured between your Splunk nodes and say a searched hosted on searched.acme.com connects to a search on indexer on idx.acme.com, the searched will verify the validity of the indexer cert, but not verify the identity by matching the indexer's host name. Now, it's really important to configure TLS hostname. It's important to remember that the TLS hostname needs to have the domain names or the host names embedded in the CNAME or SAN fields of your TLS certs. You can also configure wildcards as a host name and as part of the host name. And one key thing also to remember is that your infrastructure, if your infrastructure uses IPs predominantly and they can change, then it's important to generate the certs with IPs, because TLS handshakes will fail if there's an IP mismatch between the IP your server is hosted on versus what the IP present in the X509 cert. To remediate this issue, please upgrade your Splunk deployment to Splunk.9 and follow the required steps to turn on TLS hosting validation. The last advisory in the TLS series concerns outbound connections made from the CLI of a Splunk Enterprise node or a universal forwarder to a remote Splunk instance. For example, if you use the CLI to connect to a remote search head to execute a search, basically executing Splunk search, XYZ search -URI with the hosting of the remote search head. In this case, the CLI of the client will not validate the TLS cert of the remote search head. Now, by default, the CLI will emit warnings on standard out if TLS validation is turned off and you're connecting to a remote node. So if you start seeing warnings in your log files from CLI commands, then be aware that this pertains to this particular change. For remediation, please upgrade your Splunk Enterprise and Universal Forwarder versions to 9.0 and configure TLS between your CLI client to trust TLS certs presented by remote servers. With Splunk Enterprise 9.0, we have introduced a slew of security enhancements for deployment servers and forwarders. As a way of a quick introduction, the deployment server deployment client architecture is most commonly used in the context of forwarder management to deploy both apps and configuration updates to a customer's forwarder fleet. The current implementation of a deployment server is essentially a pub/sub message bus. Deployment clients periodically connect to the deployment server and subscribe to a client-specific topic to retrieve instructions. Now, this advisory concerns a vulnerability wherein a client can post messages on restricted channels on a deployment server. These control messages are unauthenticated and only rely on transport layer security for integrity. The consequence of this vulnerability is that any forwarder node can remotely execute code on all other forwarders subscribed to a deployment server. To remediate this vulnerability, we strongly recommend that customers upgrade their deployment servers to version 9.0. Now this change is enforced by default and no configuration is needed by the customer. Now, the current implementation of a deployment server deployment client is basically a pub/sub message bus. Deployment clients periodically connect to the deployment server and subscribe to a client-specific topic to receive update instructions. This vulnerability stems from the fact that a client can post messages on restricted channels not meant for posting. Control messages basically are unauthenticated and rely on TLS for integrity. The consequence is that any forwarder node can technically remotely execute code on all other forwarders subscribed to that deployment server. To remediate this, we strongly recommend that customers upgrade their deployment servers to 9.0. This change is enforced by default and no configuration is needed by the customer. In addition to that fact, it is also highly recommended that customers usually should have their TLS configured between their deployment servers and deployment clients. The last advisory in this series concerns access to the management port on the universal forwarder. Prior to 9.0, universal forwarders listened on 8089 for all clients by default, meaning any client over the network could actually connect to a UF on 8089 and could control the forwarder through its management API. Now, even if clients could connect over 8089, it's important to note that they still needed to successfully authenticate to the universal forwarder. And going forward, this support has been removed, and universal forwarders would only bind on localhost for their management port. And it's also important to note that by binding on localhost, the CLI for universal forwarders will still be able to work. To remediate this particular issue, please upgrade your UF to 9.0 or disable your management port by following the guide in the link documentation. I will now move on to security advisories concerning our app model. Splunk 9.0 includes several improvements to the security posture around the embedded Python shipped with Splunk Enterprise. This Python interpreter can be used by Splunk apps and add-ons to make outbound connections to external websites. With Splunk Enterprise 9.0, we will be introducing a feature that can enforce cert validation for all TLS connections made by app-related code. Specifically, the Python libraries HTTP lib and URL lib. The most common use case for Splunk apps that use the embedded Python is to establish HTTPS connections to communicate directly with Splunk over 889. The second most common use case is for mod and script inputs, wherein Splunk apps and add-ons are used to establish an outbound connection to some TLS secured web service in order to retrieve data and index it in Splunk. With our tireless efforts on helping customers easily and more effectively secure their Splunk deployments, we are introducing cert validation for Python-based apps and add-ons. This fix will ship in with the feature flag that places it in what we call warning mode, so that customers can establish better visibility as well as minimize any potential disruptions that can come by enforcing this capability, in which could, for example, result in data loss by a trusted DLS connection no longer being established. For the majority of deployments, the out-of-the-box search store that ships with Splunk Enterprise should be sufficient, as most connections will be to services that leverage publicly signed CAs for TLS certs. For cases where a customer needs support for one or more private CAs, please see the link documentation to set up TLS validation for Splunk Python modules. And now we move to the last chunk of the security advisories concerning the search language. Now, as we all know, Splunk Search Language, or SPL, encompasses all the search commands and their functions, and used to both for data searching, filtering, manipulation, insertion, and deletion of your index data. Our last advisory concerns how SPL safeguards can be bypassed and by dashboards in Splunk Enterprise versions prior to 9.0. For people who don't know, the Splunk Enterprise contains built-in SPL safeguards to warn you when you are about to unknowingly run a search that contains commands that might be a security risk. Now, these warnings appear when you either click on a link or type a URL that loads a search with with known risky commands. It's important to note that the warning does not appear when you run or create ad hoc searches. The point of the warning is to actually alert you on the possibility of unauthorized actions by a malicious actor. These unauthorized actions can include copying or transferring data, deleting, or even overwriting it. Now, in prior versions to 9.0, dashboards could let users inject risky commands in a form or a query, and thus bypassing these SPL safeguards. But in 9.0, we've introduced new capabilities which limit access to some of these custom and potentially risky commands. For a full inventory of what these capabilities are and the associated risky commands, please see the link documentation. Now I will hand it off to Sanford from our customer success team to talk about customer enablement and how they can help you upgrade to 9.0. Here you go, Sanford.
Thank you, Nabil. Now I want to talk to you about some of the things to be aware of with this upgrade. The first link for Splunk Docs refers to the Read This First page in the new version's documentation. This is a good starting point for any customer to begin their upgrade planning. In addition, there are now upgrade tips on the Splunk Lantern platform. Note that the TLS-related changes in the 9.0 release are there for informative purposes in this release. The enforcement of these changes won't happen until the next release. Knowing that public key infrastructure, also known as PKI, can be tricky to manage, it makes sense to get on board with preparing for these changes now. We know there are challenges, some of which are long-lived patterns in IT, like never upgrading to .0 releases, as well as some practical operational challenges like planning for upgrades, user testing, preparing rollback procedures, etc., to say nothing of change management. In some cases, Splunk admins may not deem these 10 material changes all that important to their security posture due to compensating controls, for example. That said, I think it's worth balancing that out with the overall set of things built into 9.0, not the least of which was learning from a series of incremental updates in our Splunk Cloud offering before merging those into the on-prem code base for 9.0. In addition, there are a bunch of new features and capabilities that are part of the overall 9.0 release, including ingest actions, Smart Store support for the Azure Cloud Platform, new federated search capabilities for bridging on-premise to cloud, and much more. Let's now take a look at the resources available to Splunk customers to assist in this transition. The old saying, "It takes a village to raise a child," can be applied to the process of maturing your use of Splunk. Thousands of professionals are available to assist in many different ways. These include our success advisors, Splunkers whose sole aim is customer success, who can help with planning and preparing long-term strategies. Next is the comprehensive suite of education offerings available to customers, focusing on various aspects of the product from basic use all the way to advanced troubleshooting. Finally, there are on-demand resources from professional services available to provide technical assistance and deep dive technical knowledge to aid in implementing your use cases. If you want to learn more about how often Splunk Enterprise updates and security features are rolled out, and what the best practices are for upgrading your deployment, check out Upgrading Splunk Enterprise on Splunk Lantern. We have listed common pitfalls we see with our customers, a typical order of operations, and things you can do before, during, and after the upgrade to monitor for system health. Not only that, we have a dedicated discussion space on Splunk Community where you can ask questions and connect with other Splunk customers and members of the Splunk Trust to ask about Enterprise 9.0. Now that was all about the self-service resources Splunk has in our arsenal to make this process smoother for you. But we do recognize that sometimes things can get a little too complicated. Worry not, for we have Splunk Professional Services here to help. Before we jump into how exactly we can help you, we first need to identify your specific needs based on your type of Splunk Enterprise deployment. We see 4 distinct patterns of deployment among our Splunk Enterprise customers. A single node deployment, sometimes called an all-in-one, which is just a single host running Splunk. In the Splunk Validated Architectures, also called SVAs, this is known as the S1 architecture. Distributed search deployments. These are SVA patterns that start with the letter D, as in Delta. These separate the role of indexing from the search head. Next, we have clustered indexer tiers. These are the C and M SVA types, featuring a dedicated cluster manager. Beyond this, we have the hybrid or large deployments, complex hybrid environments, whether mixing cloud and on-prem deployments, or with multiple distinct indexer clusters. As you can guess by now, upgrades are bound to affect different customers differently, depending upon the size and complexity of their environments. For example, clustered and hybrid customers are likely to need specific help around the new Cluster Manager Redundancy feature. If you have a simpler deployment, start by following the self-service resources we highlighted earlier, like the Upgrade Readiness app, the Lantern Guidance, and the Splunk Community. If you need more advice, use your existing on-demand service credits for an Upgrade Readiness Assessment task or an Ask an Enterprise Expert general consultative task. On-demand bridges the gap between support and professional services, providing an advisory service utilizing a work-with-you model where the customer owns the effort. If you cannot open a request or do not know if you have on-demand access, contact the ODS team at ondemand@splunk.com for assistance. If you have a larger deployment, we recommend going through a Splunk Professional Services engagement that gives you the technical expertise and assistance you need, customized to your specific situation. Professional Services utilizes our accredited consultants, solutions architects, and delivery managers to leverage the latest best practices to implement the optimal deployment of Splunk for our customers' needs. You can use the same Contact CS form to request help. We're about ready to wrap up this tech talk, but before we do, I wanted to revisit quickly the resources available to you to continue your journey. Product documentation. Even after 10 years at Splunk, I still refer to the docs daily. They are an incomparable resource. Splunk Lantern. Shining the way in the darkness. Well, at least providing some best practices guidance. Customer Q&A on the community portal at community.splunk.com. Get or give assistance to other Splunk users around the world. The product security page is there to call out specific actions that should be taken to keep your Splunk Enterprise deployment secure. Finally, there are a range of customer success services from hands-off advisory to paid consulting engagements to tackle these tasks for you. Don't forget that we have an incredible community of Splunk users on our community site. You can search the community.splunk.com site for the security subtopic under the administration section. You can also continue the conversation for this talk within the discussion section called Tech Talks at splunk.com/techtalk, where you will find all the additional resources mentioned here. Finally, there is Splunk Ideas, where you can submit new product enhancements or vote for current ideas from other customers. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to join us today. Please tune back in for future Tech Talks. We are excited to share the series with you.